I'm here. Shall we go? Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Liz Chege. I'm Festival Director of Africa in Motion, which is Scotland's annual African Film Festival. We will present our 16th festival edition this October entirely online and welcome all of you to join us. We have several films from Ethiopia screening. I'm so delighted to amplify this special event by Freedom in the City on this special occasion about the life and work of acclaimed author, political philosopher, and foreign minister, Blattengeta Herouy. Like everyone here, I look forward to learning more about him. I'll just hand over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, for that introduction and highlighting the link and the partnership between Africa in Motion and Freedom in the City Festival. My name's Jennifer Sharratt and I'm the festival producer of this fantastic festival that's a 7-month-long festival that connects the history of Bath and Ethiopia through the House of Fairfield, Haile Selassie's former residence. Blattengeta Herouy, which means Chief of Wise Men, if I'm correct, in Amharic, was a dear friend and close advisor of Haile Selassie, and he lived in exile in Bath with Haile Selassie from 1936. So this evening we're going to get a sense of who he was, his life, his philosophy, and we're going to talk to our speakers about their personal connection to him and their research. So the Freedom in the City Festival feels really connected to Blattengeta Herouy, partly because this Saturday we had a very moving service, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, hosted by Bath Abbey, that was part of our festival. You can see the recording of it if you missed it on our Crowdcast page. It was the first of its kind for Bath Abbey and signified a unity and a sense of coming together and friendship. The service was dedicated in the memory of Blattengeta Herouy, and we were fortunate enough to have his granddaughter, Emu, in attendance. What an honour then it is this evening to have Prince Asfa-Wossen Asserate, a close descendant of Haile Selassie who knew the Emperor personally, to discuss the life of Blattengeta Herouy in conversation with Dr. Shawn Sobers. Prince Asfa-Wossen Asserate, he's an Ethiopian German political analyst, a consultant for African and Middle Eastern affairs, and a bestseller of 10 books in German, 2 of which have been translated into English. And those publications are namely King of Kings, which I have behind me, and The African Exodus. A member of the Imperial House of Ethiopia, he is the great nephew of the last Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, great grandson of Empress Menen Asfaw. Dr. Shawn Sobers, who's in conversation, is the visionary director of Freedom in the City Festival of Learning, also a director of Fairfield House, Haile Selassie's former residence, professor of culture and interdisciplinary practice, and the director of Critical Race and Cultural Research Network. He's made one of his films that he's made is Footsteps of the Emperor, which documents his personal connection to Haile Selassie through Fairfield House. He's also done extensive research into Black history, heritage, and connections with slavery. So it's a real honour to welcome this evening's speakers, Prince Asfa-Wossen and Dr. Shawn Sobers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and yeah, welcome this evening. I'm on a laptop and on a mobile phone, so I'm trying to not let the technology get in the way of what I know will be a fantastic event and fantastic conversation. And it's an honour and a privilege to have Dr. Asfa-Wossen Asserate with us this evening. So welcome, Doctor. How do I address you, Dr. Asfa-Wossen? I'll call you. Is that appropriate?
Whatever you like. Don't worry about that, Shawn. That's perfect. Great pleasure for me to be here with you all.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. And we will have an opportunity to ask questions. Jennifer's going to be doing the chairing after our conversation, so please do put any questions in the chat. And and or if you want to be unmuted later, then we can ask to unmute. We do have to have security quite tight, because I know we have had Zoom bombings before and things like that. So that hence why you're all on mute automatically. So thanks for your understanding on that. So before we get into the discussion of the day, talking about the life and work of Blattengeta Herouy, can you please share with us some of your own personal story and connection with Ethiopia, with Emperor Haile Selassie, and how you came to know about Blattengeta Herouy?
Well, thank you very much indeed for having me, Dr. Sobers. It's a great pleasure to be here today to speak a little bit about the man I have always admired since my early childhood. I have family links with Blattengeta Herouy. One of his very close relatives, was married to my aunt. And as a matter of fact, it was he who started telling me about this great man when I was still a young boy. And he showed me these wonderful books that he had written. They were absolutely fascinating. And one book specifically I will always remember, and that is the book he wrote after he traveled to Japan. And obviously, here is a man whose entire life was dedicated to the modernization of Ethiopia. And then when he went there, he said to himself, this is exactly what I wish for my country. Japan was completely and utterly closed for the entire world until the latter part of the 19th century. And within a few decades, it became one of the strongest powers in Asia. And that left an incredible mark on him. And the book, I still see it in front of me with those wonderful pictures in black and white in those days, were absolutely stunning. And as time went on, I ran across a book which we had in my father's library entitled The History of the Ethiopian Emperors, the Tariq and August of Blattengeta Herouy. And that became my fate. I came to Europe in 1968 as a student to Germany, and that then started my scholarly work there in 1968, then went off to Cambridge. And when I came back to Germany, I was absolutely decided that I was going to do my doctoral thesis on something of which Blattengeta Herouy had actually come out of. And then I said to myself, why not this book? But that book in itself is the history of Ethiopia, consisting 3,000 years. I mean, it is a gigantic work, you cannot imagine. And of course, that would be too much for a doctoral thesis. So I decided to take one part of it, the years between 1700 and 1865, entitled The History of Showa, out of the Tariq and August, out of the history of the emperors of Ethiopia. Why Showa? For the simple reason that very little has been written about the history of Showa in the past. And I dare say my doctoral thesis is one of the first books that came out as a book that came out in a European language, which is German, dealing with that country, with that part of the world. And it is also fascinating to find out how the Solomonic dynasty had actually, after the end of the Aksumite Empire in the 10th century, how it slowly went down into the south and remained a vital part of Ethiopian history in the kingdom of Showa. So that was the part of my doctoral thesis. and which came out in German, and which gave me a closer look at Blattengeta Herouy. There's also a small biography in this doctoral thesis about his incredible life. Mm. Perhaps I should also mention that there's another connection which also has to do with one of his first books, which his granddaughter, Romeo, also played a role in bringing out. You know, in the year 1911, the King Emperor George V was crowned in Westminster Abbey. And at that time, Emperor Lijiyasu was the head of state of Ethiopia. And he made my grandfather his official ambassador to that occasion. And this delegation, which was led by my grandfather, Asserate Kassa, then was also one of the persons who was a part of this delegation was the Blattengeta Herouy. And it is fascinating to find out what came out of it. A magnificent book, which was edited the other day, about a year ago, and is now available in Ethiopia, is that voyage. I think you must, everybody, and I sincerely hope that one of these days it will be translated into English so that a wider audience will be able to find out how things were in this time. It is a magnificent travelogue, and I'll talk about his style a little later. And this was the first time that Blattengeta Herouy came to Europe. He accompanied my grandfather to England, then Rome, Cairo, and the Holy Land. After that, he became quite a prominent member. Once, it's very interesting. It was Asserate Kassa who found out what an amazing talent Blattengeta Herouy had. And after having seen him during this trip, he was the one who introduced him later to the then Ras Teferi Makonnen, who had just been named Crown Prince and Regent of Ethiopia in 1916. And so that is how his career started. And it went on through various stages until he reached the pinnacle when he was named foreign minister of the country in the early 1930s.
No, it's fascinating. And yeah, as you say, he is part of the delegation that came to the coronation of George V in the UK. And he also traveled to Japan. And famously, he is said that he traveled to every country in Europe at that time, one of the most well-traveled Ethiopian dignitaries. I mean, was his travel, because I'm led to believe that those travels were before his time in exile, living in Bath, and, you know, he was well-traveled before becoming a close advisor to His Majesty.
You see, he came to England with my grandfather in 1911. And then he joined the first trip of the Ethiopian regent, Ras Teferi. He joined him as Ethiopia's, at that time, as the director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He joined him in this magnificent trip, the first trip of the Prince Regent to Europe, where they traveled throughout Central Europe and, of course, came to England as well for the second time.
So what other books? You talked about that book, the history of the Ethiopian emperors. What were the other books in his kind of canon that you feel is kind of influential books that should be remembered, if not translated?
Well, let me just name a few for you. One of his early books was Ethiopia and Metemma, a short history of our Emperor Johannes IV. And then a catalogue of the books written in Ge'ez and Amharic, which can be found in Ethiopia, is another title. And then comes the Tariq and Agest, which I just mentioned, the history of Ethiopia from the Queen of Sheba until the great victory of Adwa. And I'm sure he even went further than that. We're trying to get some more, some more detail. And I'm quite sure there are papers somewhere. And hopefully we will be able to print them out there. And of course, there is one called Dirsatoch, which is all the books he had written until then. And here is a man who has written well over 20 books in his lifetime, has written many articles in Berhan al-Nasalam, the then leading Ethiopian newspaper. He was a philosopher, a great man of the church. There's a wonderful anecdote. One of the foreign ministers in Addis Ababa came up to him and said, "Excuse me, sir, where were you educated? In which university were you educated?" And he looked at him and he said, "I don't know whether you've heard of it. I was educated at the University of Ntoto. That was a magnificent monastery which we had in Ethiopia and still have in Ethiopia, and very, very well known for being one of the first places of study in our realm, which he attended and where he learned his beautiful Amharic, which made him exclusive. And we should also know he had some formal education. He spoke English, and he started also to learn Arabic. And poor him, he had to leave it very quickly because the priests in Ethiopia said he was going to become a Muslim, so he dropped it, and he didn't go with it from that day on. Yes, I think in a nutshell, this is what he is. And a bit later, I would like to give you a little a piece of what kind of a writer he was.
I just want to go back because you talked earlier about Japan and his research and writing about Japan. And where did that interest come from? I know he traveled there as well. Do you know what inspired that interest in Japan?
I think it is the interest you had in these two men, the then Crown Prince Rastafari and Blattengeta Herouy, to really go ahead with the education of a new Ethiopian generation and to modernize that ancient country called Ethiopia. I think this was the most moving part of his career, and where he put everything he had. And whenever you read his writings, even in his novels, there is something educational about them. And that is why he can be considered a pioneer of also education in Ethiopia.
What do we know about Blattengeta Herouy, the man, about his personality? And is there much research about him, by other scholars and things like that you've come across?
It is very interesting. The only thing I know about him is from what my father told me. He knew him as a young student at Monkton Combe in Bath, where my father was during the period of exile. And he remembers him as a very, very loving and very kind person who was eager to speak with the young people as well. And of whom my father told me, he learned a great deal from the stories he was able to tell him in long nights at Fairfield House. I suppose in the winter, when there was nothing else to do, they started to recount about history and Ethiopia and Ethiopian culture. So this is all I can tell you. And as you are very right, we know very little has been said about his personality. Perhaps his granddaughter will be able to tell us one day about Herouy the man. But there's a man called Ladislas Farago, an English writer, who wrote extensively about Blattengeta Herouy, and he compares him with Colonel House, who was the leading man at the time of Theodore Roosevelt in America. And I'll never forget, he named him the Colonel House of Ethiopia. Right. So we wanted to show that he was the man who had the greatest influence of the then Prince Regent Rastafari.
That's good. I mean, we're pleased to be honoured. Mrs. M.U. Tekle-Mariam, Blattengeta's granddaughter, is actually in the audience this evening. So after we speak, it'd be good to invite M.U. if she's willing. She might have some memories to share of her grandfather, so that'd be really lovely as well. So we now know of Blattengeta Herouy, and even the title of this event is the Emperor's close advisor and friend. But politically, they didn't always agree. Famously, he didn't vote for the emperor to leave Ethiopia, to come into exile. But when that vote was taken, he then very loyally joined the emperor and travelled with him to Britain in 1936 and remained here very strongly. What does that tell us, do you think, about, what do you know about that period? But what does that tell us also about that as him as an individual and also as a politician and a friend?
Dr. Sobers, the days after the Battle of Majo, early days of May 1936, were perhaps the saddest days in the history of Ethiopia. We knew something terrible was going to come back. We had lost that battle, and you must not forget a very haggard, tired emperor comes from the front to Addis Ababa. And immediately there is a council of the Imperial Court Council was called to talk about what measures should be taken after the defeat in Majo. And there was a great conversation that went on for hours and hours. The journalists tell us were waiting there, and nobody really knew at what time this meeting was going to end. And we know from various sources today that the 2 points that were discussed is whether the Ethiopian emperor should stay in Ethiopia and lead the troops wherever you might find them, there were not many left, and go into the country and fight the Italian fascism. On the other side, you had a group which was led by my grandfather, Lord Kassa, who probably realized that it was practically impossible to fight this amazing Italian attack on Ethiopia. If you see, we found out only much later on, alone Ethiopia had, just to give you an example, 8 little aeroplanes available, and mostly they were civilian aeroplanes. Italy had 1,000. Ethiopia had no tanks. The Italian had hundreds of tanks and about more than 500,000 armed men, armed with the most modern armies. So a vote was put in, and I should say, during this meeting, Blattengeta Herouy, together with 2 or 3 others, were against the emperor leaving Ethiopia. But then the overwhelming majority said, no, it is, we will be in a much better position if the emperor went to Geneva and brought the case of Ethiopia to the League of Nations. And by that vote, it was said that the emperor should leave the country immediately. And so on the 5th of May, 1936, the emperor left Addis Ababa together with the crown prince, his members of his family, Blattengeta Herouy, the foreign minister, my grandfather, Lord Kassa, and various others.
And I know it's very heavy on the emperor's heart as well to have to leave Addis Ababa. It wasn't an easy decision in the slightest. And as you say, having that support around, knowing the political landscape and the trauma that they're all going through. And what we, at Fairfield, we try to say that actually His Majesty wasn't here in exile. He was here actively campaigning for the liberation of Ethiopia,
Very much. Every day and night, there was no other thing he did. He lived for the liberation of Ethiopia, for bringing back the crown to where it was. He was one man who never accepted the fact that Ethiopia was lost. And looking back, we would never have managed to get the British to come and help us if it wasn't for the incredible work of, today you will call it lobbying, which the emperor had done during his time here in England. And of course, we mustn't forget the appeasers were no longer there when the time came. Churchill had already been voted into power in 1940. The appeasers, Neville Chamberlain and the others, who had sold us to Italy, believing they could keep Mussolini away from Hitler, And it is very interesting, the British government was the first government to recognize King Victor Emmanuel as Emperor of Ethiopia. Don't forget that, in 1936. So the minute Mussolini agreed to join the Axis Berlin-Rome, the British gave us the go-ahead, and Emperor Haile Selassie was smuggled as Mr. Smith to the Sudan. But this was late 1940.
Absolutely. I mean, go back to Blattengeta Herouy and his kind of legacy. I mean, how is he? You talked very evocatively about when you were younger and seeing the book in your father's library and things like that. How is he remembered today? His name. Is it still evoked? Is his work still talked about and mentioned, published? And also, is he remembered as an individual or always in proximity to the emperor? Can you put that in context a little bit?
Well, first of all, he's surely remembered by every scholar of Ethiopia, whether historian or whether he is a writer. Blattengeta Herouy is deemed as one of the finest writers from the way of style, from the way of introducing modern ways of writing to the Ethiopian language. All this, he's really has an established name. As far as his political works are concerned, everybody knows how much he had worked to make the foreign ministry function. And I have heard many member of the foreign ministry of Addis Ababa who said that when we have classes, the first thing we learn about the establishment of the Ethiopian Foreign Office, the first name that comes up is Blattengeta Herouy. So you could say that his name, as far as foreign policy and the modern state of Ethiopia is concerned, it will always be related to that.
No, that's good to hear. And it talked there about the scholarship. I mean, the legacy of the scholarship. You're going to talk about his style of writing.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, if you'll allow me. Just a few months ago, I found this fascinating book by a man called James de Lorenzi. and it is called Guardians of the Tradition, Historians and Historical Writing in Ethiopia and Eritrea. And if you will allow me, I think it would be very interesting also for our audience today to hear of what this very learned gentleman says about Heruy's writing. It's headed Heruy Wolde Selassie and the New Queen of Sheba. In 1923, Lilt Wazero Menen Asfaw, the wife of Crown Prince Teferi Makonnen, made a momentous journey from Ethiopia to the Middle East. Joined by a small group of companions, she set out from Addis Ababa to the French port of Djibouti, boarded a steamship to Suez and Port Said, and then traveled by train to British Mandate Palestine, where she visited many of the colony's dignitaries, religious leaders, and historic sites. On her return, she stopped in newly independent Egypt for tours of Cairo and Luxor before continuing home. Lilt Wazero Menen was accompanied on this adventure by Blattengeta Herouy, whose account of their journey offers occasional hints of the tremendous significance he believed it possessed. In one episode, Herouy wrote that as Lilt Wazero Menen and her entourage passed from the familiar landscape of the Ethiopian highlands and the Red Sea, littoral, to the comparatively foreign world of the Levant, the travelers took comfort in the fact that they were retracting the itinerary of an august predecessor. As they arrived in the Holy Land, Herouy noted that they had reached the very Gaza of Solomon, once visited by Queen Makeda or Queen Azeb, the ancient Ethiopian interlocutor of the wise Israelite king. The pilgrims were thus in the hallowed setting of the Ethiopian Gebre-Igziabher. Through this allusion to the sacred path, Herouy carefully positioned the journey as history in the remaking. A modern would-be empress was following in the footstep of Ethiopia's ancient founding mother. He ends by telling us, and this is really quite fascinating, through these references, Herouy was in effect converting the mythic Gebre-Igziabher into documented history. This effort resembles several other creative historical projects of the era, which has also blurred generic lines and flaunted distinctions between history and myth, fact and fiction. Herouy's historicized travelography is a variant on such factual fiction, as he calls it, factual fiction.
I like that.
In that it fuses biography and reportage with stylized macro-historical arguments and mytho-historical metaphors. Travel writing allowed him to reconcile past and present, the ancient and the modern, and the sacred and the profane in one single text. It also allowed him to conceptualize the wider world without recourse to historicism and its analytic categories. This is an incredible sentence. It also allowed him to conceptualize the wider world without recourse to historicism and its analytic categories. So this is how Herouy is seen by a complete stranger, a non-Ethiopian.
I mean, it's interesting, just thinking about the language and the translation. You're talking earlier about, books that have been translated or not into English, and it just makes you realize the bodies of knowledge that are out there, let alone what we can read in our own mother tongues, but what we're not able to read in other mother tongues.
This is,
you know,
this
it's just a
it.
drop in the ocean. Any bodies of knowledge that any of us have, but drop into the ocean of the global knowledge that actually, of knowledge that we're not able to access. It just makes you really,
you know, and you know, Dr. Sobers, we shouldn't forget we're only talking about one country, Ethiopia.
absolutely.
Look at the other African countries. Look at the incredible history of ancient emperors in Africa. Who knows which African knows anything much about that great empire called Mali? You know, and in the 16th century, the emperor of Mali was one of the richest men in the whole wide world. Tell that to an African today. We're really in a terrible situation. And the new generation of Africans must stand up and see to it that this oral tradition that has been going on for centuries is slowly also put into paper, so that other generations can gain, as you rightly said, from the wisdom of our ancestors.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad you said that, because that particular point about the oral tradition translated into documented text and research, that is actually the core of the inspiration behind this festival, behind the Freedom of the City Festival. There's so much knowledge that exists out there, you know, in everyday life. You know, I work at the university, but I know that knowledge doesn't reside in a university. Knowledge is just where it ends up when someone's written a book about it. But actually, true knowledge is in the street, it's in the pub, it's in the bookies, it's in the park, you know, from all ages. And that's what I'm really inspired by and interested in. And so I'm just really pleased that and I think that for myself within the Rastafari tradition, there's a strong oral history and oral knowledge tradition within Rastafari, let alone, like you say, all the other knowledges and languages that are of the oral tradition. So it's very much on my mind that these things also need publishing. So thank you. We were going to look to then bring it up to date then to talk about
well, it's not only me who has to talk today, you have to talk as well. And now we're going to change the whole thing. And I'm going to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind, Dr. Shawn. Perhaps you'd be able to tell us a little bit more about the way Blattengeta Herouy died, a little bit about his burial. You might perhaps note what the emperor said during the funeral of Blattengeta Herouy.
Yeah, so sadly, it's a short time that Blattengeta Herouy was in the city of Bath. So he died on the 19th of September 1938. So he is in Bath for 2 years, living at Fairfield House. He also travelled to London, did some teaching at the School of Oriental African Studies in London, and but it was a short and tragic time. And I can show you, actually, if you don't mind, the newspaper clipping. Let me just do the PowerPoint. I can show you the newspaper clipping that announced his death. This is the Herald newspaper on the 20th of September 1935. There's other clippings as well. Foreign Minister dies at Bath, and the full title was "The Emperor Loses His Closest Friend." It's reported that Blattengeta Herouy had a long illness for several months, and then died on this day. And it seemed that he knew that time was coming. That there's documentation that his will was updated, and officially kind of registered a few days before his death, etc. So his illness, I don't know exactly what the circumstances were, and I guess it's not for me to say that here, but he's died of illness, and 19th of September, and then his burial was the next day on the 20th of September 1938. my sister ringing me. I said I'm having to use my mobile phone for the audio. So this is the chapel at Fairfield House, and before the burial, which I'll go into in a moment, this is where where a private service was held at Fairfield House in tribute to Blattengeta. Oh, am I still sharing? Can you see this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, good. And so at this burial was the priests, all the household of Fairfield House, as well as there was a local gentleman, Mr. H. Lay of Lower Weston, which is an area not far from Fairfield. Actually, you could say Fairfield is a part of Lower Weston, and he is named as the local man responsible for the funeral arrangements. And it's also documented in the Bath Chronicle, which was a few days later on the 24th of September, that a press photographer was at the funeral, at the chapel, but he was told by a member of the delegation politely to not take any photographs because it was, the emperor wanted it to be a very private ceremony for his close friend. After the chapel, which anyone that knows Fairfield House will have seen that this area has been recently renovated into what we call the Sacred Peace Garden, with very beautiful, but you can see here is renovated from a greenhouse structure. This photograph was taken in 1954, so it's already slightly dilapidated, but in the 1930s, it would have been a lot tidier than this. So this is Fairfield House up in the top corner, and this is Locksbrook Cemetery where the actual then burial took place. As you can see, it's not far from Fairfield House at all, and it is the closest cemetery to Fairfield. So just to go in a little closer, oops, sorry. So this is where the actual grave is. This is the entrance. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the entrance on the bottom right there, where you can see the paths joining together. So it's a very beautiful cemetery, as a lot of cemeteries are. It's no longer used today for burials, but at that time, when this happened, 1938, it was one of the main cemeteries in the city. It's documented the level of emotion that was there at the funeral. It's documented that the emperor, Empress Menen, and many members of the household were visibly and audibly, affected by this moment. And it's said that, the emperor and the empress had tears in their eyes, and also the emperor, when he gave his speech, that he had to pause and, his voice croaked because the emotion was very palatable. Again, in the Bath Chronicle of 1938, it talks about the chief mourners of the funeral being Asserate Kassa, which is his son, Crown Prince, Princess Zuriash Worq, Princess Tashire, Duke of Ferrara, Dr. Martin, litigation minister, and all members of the household. It says the whole of the household staff at Fairfield were there, and wreaths were sent by both the emperor and the empresses, the crown princesses and princesses, the Duke of Ferrara, and also from the headquarters of the Abyssinian Association and the local branch of the Friends in Fairfield. So yeah, it's very deeply felt, and the report at the time really shows that very strongly. Shall I continue to talk about the speech? So there's a book, the speeches of His Majesty, which is documented in the Third Testament Ilex verses, and on page 644, it's got the full speech that His Majesty read at the graveside. So if you don't mind, I shall, you know, it's short, but it's very powerful. The man whose last rites we now perform and who now goes to the last resting place is Blattengeta Heruy Wolde Selassie, a gentleman, well-bred, who stands amongst the foremost of Ethiopia's intellectuals. This illustrious son of our beloved country employed his intelligence and energies for the betterment of his country and was therefore selected for the high post of Minister of Foreign Affairs in our government. The books he wrote, which portray his noble character, and especially those pertaining to history and theology, have made him renowned. It is hardly necessary to say more of his intellectual attainments and how profoundly we feel about the greatness of his character, about his dedication to a purposeful life, his selfless devotion to help those in trouble, his respect for truth and justice, and his burning patriotic zeal for his country, all of which touch our heart deeply at this hour of his departure. My loyal friend Herouy, if our words prove inadequate in extolling what you have done for your country to the fullest of your ability on this mournful occasion, your deeds themselves will certainly speak more convincingly. Even though the storm of aggression that upset the tranquility of the world brought you suffering and a severe test of your moral endurance, you did not permit it to overwhelm you. Now, however, it has become your fate to obey the order of the great and merciful Lord, a lot that befalls each and every one of us in our turn. As it were, after you had accomplished what was within your bounds, you have slept, but also you depart from us physically. Your works and your names will always remain amongst us. Dear Herouy, as God the Almighty has permitted us to lay your bones, rest with bones, while your spirit joins with those of your fathers, we bid you goodbye in this hospitable land to which we came as guests. And His Majesty wrote that on the 19th of September and recited it at the graveside on the 20th, the following day, which I just think is a really powerful, beautiful and emotional tribute, really.
You know, there's one sentence that I lack in the English translation, because I have it in my ear. His last words were in Amharic, Herouy hiaune. Herouy, you are eternal.
Right.
So somebody must have forgotten something when it was translated.
Yeah. I mean, that's the other thing about translation, that it's going to capture sentiments in the language it's been translated to, which doesn't always do justice to the words of the mother tongue that is written in.
Yes, it would be very interesting, Dr. Sobers, if you could tell us what happened to the body afterwards. How did it go back to Ethiopia?
Yeah, so just before I actually touch on that, I want to say also that the reporters that reported the grave, the funeral, talked about how the majority of the service was in Amharic and also in Ge'ez. And so they said that, you know, as the English speakers that were present, they weren't able to fully understand, but they could understand it through the emotion in which it was delivered, which I thought was, again, a beautiful sentiment. So I came to know first the name of Blattengeta Herouy in 1999 when I was doing some research for a film that I was making called Footsteps of the Emperor, which Jennifer talked about earlier. And this is the grave that I found at that time. in 1999. So you can see the Amharic writing at the front of the grave. And, you know, what I didn't, like I say, I didn't know it was there. The name Blattengeta Herouy in 1999 was new to me, so I had to do my research. And then I contacted I then read in the local newspaper that I just showed you that the burial happened in Locksbrook. So then I contacted the council and they did the location to find it. So then moving forward, so I featured the grave in the film and spoke and, you know, included part of that quote. Then a really strange mystical thing then happened, which I think is rather beautiful. In 2016, I was at Fairfield House, and it's an Ethiopian kind of cultural day. Don't remember exactly which one, but I got talking to a lady that was there, and she said, "Oh, my grandfather used to live here, and he died here." I said, "Oh, right, okay, that's interesting. What's the name of your grandfather?" She said, "Blattengeta Herouy." And I said, "Oh, that's you know," I said I spoke about him in a film that I made and featured his grave, which is down the road at Locksbrook Cemetery. And the lady, which I then came to find out was MU Tekla Mariam, who's in the audience tonight, she said, "Oh, no, his grave's in Ethiopia." I said, "Well, yeah, I found out the body was exhumed." So this goes back to your question. The body was exhumed from Locksbrook Cemetery on the 4th of September, 1947, by a Home Office license, which was requested by the Emperor. So the body was exhumed and taken back to Addis Ababa, where it was then buried. And but the grave stone remains in Bath, the original one with the Amharic. So this was, you know, there were so many people in that room. So for me and MU to have just struck up a conversation, and to be honest, I'm quite an introvert. I'm often on the sides, kind of hugging the wall and not really chatting. I can be quite shy in those sort of situations. So it's just a really beautiful moment that we struck up this conversation. So we jumped in cars, about 2 or 3 cars went down to Locksbrook. And then, you know, bearing in mind it was a long time since I had been there myself, but we managed to find the grave. And actually, the reason why I remembered where it was, Keith Bowers, who's in the audience tonight as well, when he was writing his book, I showed him the grave. So that's why, you know, it was a long time between 1999, but it is more recently that I actually did go there. So when we got to the grave, it's actually a very sad what we found. And again, I'll show the screen again, if it's going to let me. And this is what we found. The gravestone, you know, it completely, as they do in graveyards, you know, the cross had toppled, and over time, the wear and tear had got to the gravestone. So it's very sad, you know, and as a kind of, you know, we're custodians at Fairfield House. We see ourselves as custodians of the space, you know, and, you know, try to take care of it for future generations. And graveyards are such entities as well, where you know, you want to do right by them in respect for who was there. So it's very sad seeing it in this state of repair or disrepair. So what myself and MU talked about at that moment was to do some work to try to restore the gravestone. So we started to do some fundraising. I had some funding from the university, and, you know, did different things. And in terms of raising funds, we did a Ethiopian cultural day at Fairfield House to raise awareness on it. And it is very beautiful. But before I show that, I just want to show some close-ups of the grave at that time. So again, this is 2016. You know, you can see the lead writing on the Amharic is really faded. You know, but it's still there. It's still very much intact. It's just the weather. It was nothing malicious. It's just the weather that got to it. But it's a very interesting moment being there, because even though, you know, in a graveyard, you know, it's a moment of kind of sadness, and it is also sad seeing the disrepair of the grave. But actually, it is a very it's very, I don't know, I like Emu to talk about it as well. It's a very, I guess, heartfelt moment as well, because all of a sudden, people from Fairfield House came to this place, and actually there was something to unite around. The fact that the grave was still there, and it was beautiful. You could see the care and love and attention that was put into that gravestone at that time. And actually it became a new landmark in the city of Bath to remember the legacy and that history, and also this individual. So we had the gravestone restored, and this is what we found. This is what it looked like after we had it restored, where the lettering, it went to a stonemason in Trowbridge, worked with a local woman, Sophia Mackenzie, and also Keith, and you know, it's just fantastic having the grave restored at this level. So when we did the unveiling of the gravestone, we had, I think it was 4 or 5 generations of MU's family there to witness the unveiling, members of the community, and also Prince Michael McConnell was there at the engraving as well. And it's just a really beautiful occasion for that to come forward at that moment. At this point, I'd like to bring in MU. I'll make MU a co-host. Sorry. So MU, if you can hear, if you're happy to come onto the stage.
Okay.
It'd be lovely to hear some of your thoughts at this point. I'll stop sharing the screen.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, yeah.
Okay. At that moment, it was an emotion I couldn't understand myself, because I never for one moment believed there was a graveyard there when you told me, when we first met and you told me about it. So it was only after I went and saw it that I really truly believed you, because we were all told that there was nothing left here. And then after the just before the fundraising, to have it built, to have it reconstructed, we gathered some money, and then we had to find somebody to do the graveyard, to do the grave. I went to this small village who did the masonry, the work, and they said, "How are you related?" And I told them he's my grandfather. And then they said, "Do you have proof?" I said, "I don't have proof. I don't carry proof like that." How do you expect me to carry proof? Is there any other way we can do this? No, you must have proof you're related to him. So I said, isn't there anything we can do? And then finally said, who paid for the expenses at the time? I said, "I don't know, maybe the emperor paid for him." And the lady said, "No, he did not pay." Then I said, "Who else could pay for him but the emperor?" She wouldn't tell me. Then I thought, and I said, "Could it be Sharat Herouy?" She said, "Yes." And I said, "That's his son and my uncle." And that way I was able to get the permission to go ahead and do the work.
Right.
So,
yeah, I remember actually, because when I had to first contact the council, I don't know if you were able to put your camera on. I know you weren't expecting to come on, so if you don't want to put the camera on, that's absolutely fine.
That's okay.
Yeah, but yeah, I remember. Oh, brilliant, beautiful.
You see my? Okay.
Yeah, we can see you. We can see you.
Oh,
Beautiful. Yeah, I remember when I contacted the council to say we wanted to renovate, you know, to do it, and they said it has to be a blood relation, you know, descendant to do it. And yeah, and like you say, then that's when you had to take it on and do that negotiation with them.
Yes.
But yeah, who does have that proof?
They negotiated. Well, they negotiated with the council. I negotiated with the workmen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's interesting you said that when we were speaking at Fairfield, that you couldn't believe it. I mean, can you tell us about his grave in Addis Ababa and what you've come to know about your grandfather? And also, myself and the Prince earlier were talking about him as an individual, as a man. What's your memories of him? And I guess a bit later you could talk about your understanding of his gravestone.
I don't know him personally. I was born years after he died. But from conversations, from what I heard about from various family members, was that he was a very meticulous man. You had to keep time. If you don't keep time, 1 minute late, 1 minute early, you won't see you.
Right, okay.
But he was very kind and very understanding to children. And Princess Heruy, the granddaughter of the emperor, knew him very well in Bath. So I said, how do you know, what did you know about him? She said, we were very close, all the children were very close to him. Because when we wanted something and the emperor denied us, we would go to your grandfather. We would talk to him. If he would understand us, he would go to the emperor and tell him our case. And he comes back with a permission for us to do whatever way that we denied. And once, Princess Tananya, his daughter, she and I was sitting in London having a chat, and I was talking straight to the point to her. And she said, you remind me of your grandfather. I said, how? You don't go around the bush, you just say what you think you just come out and say what you want to say. I said to her, was he like that? She said, yeah, he was like that.
Right.
The same with the Crown Princess, Princess
Medfarash.
Princess Medfarash. We're having lunch at the Crown Prince House. She asked me some questions and I just said it to her straightforward because I didn't know how else to put it. I was not a diplomat. I've never been a diplomat, so it just came out. And the princess said, you and your family, you're straightforward. You could have said it in a nicer way. And the Crown Prince said, listen to her. She comes from a very educated family. She knows what she's saying. And there's no other way of saying it anyway. So this, and from my family members, he was very much attached to his children and to his wife. Most of the nights he was working he had two small rooms in his house. One is prayer room, another one is his office. Right. Once he enters either one, nobody speaks to him but the emperor. And in his office, sometimes scholars would gather. So they debated during the night because he has no time. He has no time during the daytime. He's always at the palace or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So they spent most of the time in that room debating whatever they were talking about or whatever. And sometimes my aunt used to tell me, she used to be very annoyed with him. My aunt and my cousin were very annoyed with him because they had to sit outside the room to cater for any of their needs until whatever time they finish.
Right.
That's what I know about him.
No, beautiful. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. We'd like to keep you on the screen. I know Princess Asfa-Wossen has to go soon as well. So I think this would be a great opportunity, I think, to bringing the audience, if there's any questions for either of you, so if you don't mind staying on the screen there, Emily, that would be fantastic.
I'll be here.
Thank you.
So Jennifer, do you want to come back in and
yeah, thank you all of you for that insight into the man himself. I've got some questions in the chat. Could I read them out to you? So it's Dear Prince Asfa-Wossen Asserate, what would you say was Heruy Wolde Selassie's role during the Ethiopian first delegation to the League of Nations, and the importance of that delegation, especially in the time of colonialism all over the world? And that's from Fazea.
Well, this was another pioneering task which he performed. And you must not forget, Ethiopia joined the League of Nations knowing that sooner or later, Italy was going to try and recolonize or try colonizing Ethiopia again. And we sincerely believe that that new world order after the Versailles Treaty, after the First World War, was that the stronger countries would always come to the liberation and to assistance of smaller countries whenever they were attacked by major countries. And this was the greatest illusion which we had, and also why the League of Nations failed, because of the Ethiopian question. Here is a country seeking the help of an organization it joined simply because of this fact, knowing what was going to come. And this help was denied by the League of Nations. You must not forget, in his memoirs, the late emperor writes that one of the most terrible days of his life was the minutes he spent in the Palace des Nations in Geneva, when he came in and you had a president who had fascist leanings, and you had this incredible amount of fascist Italian journalists who started to whistle, who started to call him names. There was a complete turmoil before he even started to talk when he went to the rostrum. And there was only one delegate from all the delegates of the world who stood up, because nothing was happening from the side of the president, and uttered those unbelievable words: Monsieur le Président, à la porte les sauvages. Mr. President, take these savages away. And it's only then, and by the way, the man who said that was the foreign minister of another small country, Romania, by the name of Titulescu. So what Heruy had hoped for, where he put all his, whatever he could do, so that Ethiopia could join. Don't forget, there was a long story of people saying, no, you're not allowed to join it. And funnily enough, Ethiopia was allowed to join the League of Nations because Italy said yes in 1922. It was unbelievable, you see. So I would say, yes, he played an incredible role. And when we mention the name of the League of Nations and the Ethiopian delegation, I think it would be also very fair to mention the name of Fitaurari Tekle Haryat. Tekle Haryat was the Ethiopian delegate in 1936 in Geneva, who played also a very significant role.
Thank you.
We have another question. Many thanks, Princess Asfa-Wossen, for the interesting and well-informed presentation. Can you say a little bit more about Blattengeta Heruy's pioneer role as a public intellectual of his generation of educated Ethiopians?
Well, you could say that he was one of the first generation to get also formal education within Ethiopia. You know, he was born at the time of Emperor Menelik, who started the first school, the Menelik school in Addis Ababa. And, you know, there were enough teachers in Addis Ababa at the beginning of the 20th century, we had a number of missions. And Blattengeta Herouy was a man who always looked for more education. And he was always to be found in the offices of directors of missionary institutions. He was very closely befriended to the German mission in Addis Ababa and also the Swedish mission there. And I think that is where he also found and we got to know study the English language. So he was one of the very first people in Ethiopia, you could say, to be able to have a little bit of foreign education, formal education, as we might call it today. And he reveled at that. He was a man of knowledge, a man who always looked forward to learning more. And because he believed this is the greatest thing that has been given to man, his ability to think.
Thank you. I was very interested in what you said about the stories that your father was telling you that he'd been told by Blattengeta Herouy. And I was wondering whether you could expand a little bit on those stories.
Well, to be honest with you, I think you said that told us some of it. He was in the same position as the granddaughters of the emperor at that time, and he had actually he himself was able to witness all what we just heard. I don't think I could tell you more, but I think one thing we should mention, which has not been mentioned today, is another great task which Miyu really delivered to us, and that is to see to it that the house of the late Blattengeta Herouy, she struggled years and years so it could be given to the Academy of Ethiopian Sciences. And what a better institution to have in the house of the late Blattengeta Herouy. And I think that institute is also named after him.
Can I ask Emu about that as well? So has that happened with his house, or is that still in process, or has that happened?
It happened about 10 years ago or so. It was being used for a high school in Addis Ababa. And my cousins and I sat down and said, we cannot just sit and watch just a school being occupied by our grandfather. We have to have it given to a greater institution and have it really, really remembered as his house and as a great institution. So we thought of two places. The first was the University of Addis Ababa. The second was the Ministry of
Science.
No, the Ministry of
Education.
the Minister.
The
Minister of Culture.
Yes.
Ministry of Culture. So my cousin and I went to first visit the Ministry of Culture. But the secretaries looked down on us as if we came from outer world. They would not let us see the minister or talk to the minister. So I said, okay. We said, okay. Then we went to see Professor Andreas, the then president of the University of Addis Ababa. He treated us as if we were princesses. He laid out the red carpet for us and received us in his office. We told him what we wanted. We had already written an application for that, submitted the papers, and he said, don't worry, it will take time. I must find a good time to talk to the Prime Minister, who was the late Meles Zenawi then. But bear with me, I will do it for you. So I kept getting in touch with the professor every 4 or 5 months or every 6 months, just to remind him. He kept saying, don't worry. And one day out of the blue, I get a telephone call from the Prime Minister's office. And at that time, I thought I was going to go to prison because I didn't know why the Prime Minister's office would call me. And I said, what have I done now? And the secretary, he said, you've done nothing. So why is the Prime Minister's office calling me? Can I please, we would like to have the address of your grandfather's house. I said, oh my God, thank you very much. So I said to him, I'll call you back with the correct address. I called him back with the correct address, and then it started rolling. Finally, thanks ever so much, Prime Minister Meles. I know you can't hear me. He signed the papers over to Professor Andreas. And then Professor Andreas delegated Professor Masresha and Professor Shubru to deal with it. And everything went smooth. And what an opening day we had, as the Science and Technology Academy was officially opened. It was unbelievable, unbelievable. It was like a Saturday night. I couldn't believe myself that such an occasion would happen, not in my wildest dreams. It was set up so beautifully. And the person who didn't want to see us, the Ministry of Culture, came to told the opening night, afternoon. Anyway, it's now in the hand of Science and Technology, and it's being kept very well. And they've spent millions trying to bring up the house into its position now. So
that's really good. That's really good to hear. It also presents the opportunity of connections and communications between Fairfield House and what we're doing with those legacies back in Ethiopia. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I'm afraid I have to leave you now, but perhaps one question.
Cressida Marcus has asked, where did his son Cyril translate Rasselas? Yeah.
I think didn't he do it when he was up at Oxford?
Oh, okay. She was wondering whether it was.
I wonder, was it Romeo? Am I right in saying that?
I believe he did it while he was in Oxford as a student.
That must be it. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us, Princess.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I'm very sorry that I have to leave you now, but I have to go into another event, which is going to start in 10 minutes. So
I really appreciate
it was a great pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And we'll stay in touch, definitely.
Absolutely.
Goodbye, Dr.
Good to see you, Asfa-Wossen.
Right.
Wonderful to see you, my dear. It's all your fault that I'm here. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
I wonder whether we can have a little bit more time to see whether there were any more questions to you, Shawn, about the grave of Blattengeta Herouy and your personal connection to that.
My personal connection, as I said, I found out the name Blattengeta Herouy kind of by accident, really, when I was doing the film Footsteps of the Emperor. But then it just really inspired me, or crept up on me and inspired me, because I think, for me, we know with Fairfield House that it was a house primarily of three functions. It's a family home, it was a government in exile, and it is also spiritual home with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and presence. And obviously for good reason, we know the name Haile Selassie and do that research and tell those stories. But there are also other stories as well that I'm also really interested in, of who else was in that space, who else was around the emperor, supporting the emperor, and what were the other tangential. And I guess as a researcher, historian, academic, I'm interested in those other stories as well. So Blattengeta Herouy was one that really captured me. And I guess, like I say, when I met Emu at that time, at that event, which was, you know, we say nothing's by accident, everything is by kind of design, but beautiful serendipity. That for me, that presented an opportunity that I didn't really want to let go of, because okay, there's something being presented here where you know, the body of this gentleman was taken back to Ethiopia, but something's left remaining in the city of Bath. And when it remains in the city of Bath, then it should be taken notice of, particularly a grave such as this. So for me, it presented an opportunity of remembrance, of this enlarging the narrative and story of the time the royal delegation lived in Bath, and to really get a, you know, a fuller understanding about how that was and how it operated and who else was around in that time. So to then find out more about Blattengeta and find out he was a scholar, you know, wrote you know, 23 plus books and well-traveled, and, you know, all these other narratives, all of a sudden it just opens a door to another side and of this culture that we just weren't aware of before. So yeah, so for me, it just really captured the imagination, and I'm really just pleased to be able to be able to you know, do what we did in terms of restoring the grave, work with Emu, what we did yesterday at Bath Abbey with the Ethiopian Orthodox church service. Yeah, for me, all those things are it's just really important, really, that all these names are remembered and these individuals' names are remembered. They're all pioneers, and yeah, worthy of our attention and respect and attention.
Absolutely. And I remember you saying that you'd researched it in the archives, and there were a few newspaper cuttings. And I'm wondering how that idea of oral traditions maybe not being recorded, like you're saying, the main person that's living in Fairfield House, so Haile Selassie, there's a lot of information about him, but not so many people around the periphery, and how we capture those oral stories or those personal connections before it's too late.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about kind of our education growing up in the UK and hearing about the court of Henry VIII, for example, you know, Thomas Becket and Seymour, you know, we know all the names of his courtiers and all these kind of things. That, and you kind of just take it for granted, but that doesn't often happen when it comes to African history, that we kind of, you know, hear about those main pillars, but not those other things around it. So for me, yeah, I think it's really important that we ourselves tell our stories and document our narratives and do any little bits of research we can write. I mean, I'm always a firm believer, and I say this to my students all the time: interview your parents, interview your grandparents. You know, they have bodies of knowledge that we just take for granted. They're just our parents and grandparents, you know, but actually I'm going to research that over there. But for me, actually, some of the biggest repositories of knowledge are actually living in our own spaces. They're the ones who reared us and grew us. So I'm a firm believer in research quite close to home, not necessarily far away, if you like. So that's why, I guess, in the way I work, I am interested in those family dynamics and those close stories. So for me, that proximity with Blattengeta Herouy kind of, yeah, it spoke to that as well. Really. Yeah.
And what an opportunity for the city of Bath, actually, to have that, you know, the grave of Blattengeta Herouy just there. Yeah, a really good part of that.
Yeah, and I've heard people now saying that, you know, they're just walking their dog and they didn't hear about it or didn't know about it. They see the grave and the ribbon, they go up and read about it. And then they start doing their own little bits of research, and they might put it on social media. You know, for me, all of those things are really important, you know, where we kind of bump into something by accident, but it piques your interest. And that then you scratch the surface and you start to find out more. You know, when for part of the festival, we put billboards up the other day on Lurbister Road, and you were there as well. And the great thing for me about that day was a guy who was driving past on a motorbike and he saw the name Haile Selassie on the billboard. He's like, oh yeah, you know, I just heard about that last week, and there's a house up there somewhere, and I'm now going to find out more. So for me, it's that kind of research by stealth or raising awareness by stealth. It's not always doing these big grandiose things, you know, is actually just piquing people's interest where they go and do research for themselves. Often that can have a bigger effect rather than trying to tell people to be interested. They become interested by themselves. So that's part of the cemetery.
Is the cemetery open to the public to visit?
Yes, it is. It is. It's a public space. You know, it's dog walkers. You know, it's there. It's on. So it's sort of in between Fairfield House and Victoria Park. I'm not sure exactly what that stretch of road is called, but if you look up Locksburg Cemetery, which is LOCKSBROOK, Locksburg Cemetery, you'll find it very easily. And I guess just before we close, I'll just quickly put back up show it on the map where it is. Is that William's in the audience, and he went to find it the other day, and I found myself having to write instructions of where it is. And actually, I was very pleased he found it. I was very proud of that. So again, can you see my cursor on the screen? I think you can. Yeah. So that's the entrance there. You just basically follow the path straight, and then it's 2 in from the path. There's a grave in front of it. I am going to be going back there and renewing the ribbon. The ribbon's got slightly faded now, and it does need some renewal. So yeah, I'll be going back there soon and yeah, tidying it up a little bit. It's still very tidy. Just the ribbon needs replacing. But no, thank you, and thank you for everyone for comments and questions. It's been fascinating listening to MU and the Prince.
Absolutely. So thanks so much, and thanks for joining us this evening for the Freedom in the City Festival with Prince Asfa-Wossen Asserate and Dr. Shawn Sobers, talking about their personal connections and their research into Blattengeta Herouy. And thank you, Emu, as well. Lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us and for giving us such a personal account. We have our next festival event is on the 25th, this Saturday, and it's African Queens. You can find it on Crowdcast. I want to say a big thank you to Africa in Motion, Liz Chege, who is our partner, as well as our other festival partners, BEMSCA, Fairfield House, HHRC, UE, and Bath Black Families. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, and have a look at our Crowdcast and join us for another event. Okay, thank you.